Welcome back to part two. So we just read Sighting of the Pacific. So now let's do the closed read. They want us to underline facts that are similar to the historical account that we read before. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take my underline tool and I'm going to look for important details that are similar. So I see important details like similar people, such as Mr. Lewis and Mr. Clark. I see that they've discovered the estuary of the Columbia River. I see that on November 15th, they actually discovered the Pacific Ocean. And so there's a lot of interesting details that are the same. Now they want me to put a star next to anything that is made up or fictional. So right here, anything that has to do with Peter, Peter is made up. So Peter, there's obviously no Peter involved. Anything that has to do with additional men being in the party, that was not the case. So that's also fictional. Any dialogue is also going to be fictional as well. So now what I want to do is I'm going to come up and I'm going to answer the chart. So I already put my answers here so that you can see. So some of the fictional details we had were Peter and all of his thoughts and feelings, as well as the additional men in the group, as well as any of the dialogue spoken by Mr. Clark and Mr. Lewis, and also the man that was speaking towards the end. So go ahead and pause and type that in. Okay, now let's continue. So at the bottom it says which fact presented in the Journey to the Pacific is also included in the fictional story above. Is it A, Peter played a key role as a member of Lewis and Clark's team? B, some of the explorers felt that the ocean was a sight for sore eyes? C, Peter tried to keep up his spirits during the expedition? Or D, the explorers had mistaken an estuary for the Pacific Ocean? Well, we already know that Peter is made up, so that means that A and C is not the correct answer. And where it says some explorers felt the ocean was a sight for sore eyes, that's actually made up information. So the correct answer would be D. And moving on to the show your thinking, it says describe how the author of Sighting the Pacific used and altered historical details about the Lewis and Clark expedition story. So I'm going to say um, the author used historical details such as um, them mistaking the estuary as the Pacific Ocean, and they used fiction by creating dialogue to make the story more interesting. And I spelled that wrong in me. In not what I wanted to do. Interesting. Okay. Bring that down. And I'll also change the color so it's easier for you guys to see. Okay, let's move on. So now we're going to read another historical account called Orphan Train Riders. By the mid-1800s, the New York City streets were filled with an estimated 30,000 poor and hungry children. Many were homeless or abandoned. They sold newspapers, rags, and matches in order to earn money and live on the streets in all kinds of weather. Often forming gangs in order to protect themselves, the children led hard lives, but it was the only life they knew. In 1853, Charles Loring Brace, a young minister, took it upon himself to help these children. When a child stands in front of you in rags with a tear-stained face, he said, you cannot easily forget him. Brace founded the Children's Aid Society, an organization devoted to moving children from the streets of New York City to homes in rural areas across the country. Later referred to as the Orphan Train Movement, the first step in the process was to load needy children onto what became known as orphan trains. The children were then transported to 47 states and Canada. Brace believed that loving families in rural areas would adopt these children. He hoped they would grow up with the education and support needed to become productive members of society. Handbills advertised the arrival of the orphan train in town. The orphans were cleaned up and displayed on stage in front of curious crowds. Potential parents poked and inspected the children like livestock. Siblings were often split apart. Some children ran away or some were abused. Others found supportive people whom they considered family for the rest of their lives. Regardless of the outcome, however, most found the experience and transition to a new life to be difficult at best. Yet overall, the program resulted in positive outcomes. Two orphans even grew up to be state governors. The mass relocation of needy children across the country was Brace's best effort to reconnect them with better lives. The orphan train movement was later considered to be the beginning of the foster care system. So they want us to go ahead and circle three details that help us identify that this passage is a historical account. So you want to look for details that statistics or numbers. So right here at the very beginning, it says by the mid 1800s, there were estimated 30,000 poor and hungry children. This is also important. In 1853, Charles Loring Brace took it upon himself to help these children. And then finally, a third thing that we can do is we can discuss the orphan train movement, and also that Brace founded the Children's Aid Society. So we actually circled four. Now they want us to underline some important facts that the author presents about the orphan train movement. So, first and foremost, the orphan train movement was supposed to help an estimated 30,000 children in New York City streets in order to help them find families. It was founded by Charles Loring Grace, and it was later referred to as the Orphan Train Movement. And they moved these children from New York City all the way to new homes in rural America. And so that's pretty much what you needed to know about that. Now, now let's go ahead and we're going to read the historical fiction in part three.